So in the last lecture, I introduced this idea of philosophy of mind. Philosophy of mind asks, how do we explain the human mind and, other minds too, animals, and also how do we understand it? And before we get to Nagel, I want to talk about one very common approach to these questions, one very common approach in philosophy of mind, because Nagel is really, more than anything, trying to develop a criticism of this approach. He thinks it's wrong. He thinks it misses something. So I think to understand what Nagel's doing, we really need to understand what this approach is and what Nagel thinks it misses. And that approach is what we might call materialism or functionalism. Now, actually, materialism is a bit more general than functionalism. Functionalism is pretty much a type of materialism, but it really is the most common type. So I won't talk about other kinds of materialism, really. I'm going to focus more on functionalism. And you can almost use these interchangeably because most philosophers who are materialists, for the most part, are some kind of functionalist. Okay, so what is materialism? Materialism is the view that thinking and the mind are just properties of matter, just properties of material stuff. Look, I've got a desk in front of me that my computer and this microphone I'm talking into are sitting into. The desk has certain properties. It's relatively solid. It's gray, kind of a semi-rough, semi-smooth texture, kind of midway between the two. The point is, you can explain all these properties of the desk, it being gray, it being fairly solid, it having the texture it does, in terms of the material stuff that makes the desk up. The same goes for a coffee cup. The same goes for the computer in front of me. We'll talk more about that in a second. And materialists will say, well, that goes for the human mind. In some way, thinking can be completely and adequately explained in terms of material stuff and its properties. In the same way that we can understand and explain every single thing about this desk in terms of the material stuff that makes it up and the way that stuff is arranged, we can understand the human mind by seeing the material stuff that makes up our bodies, at least the important parts of our bodies for the mind, presumably the brain, and how that stuff is arranged. Well, look, materialism could take a lot of different forms, right? Look, different ways of, the mind, if it's part, it works together in certain ways. You're not going to explain it in the same way you understand a table, right? Lots of different scientific fields that study material things in different way. Geology is not biology, and biology is not inorganic chemistry. So what scientific field is the best for understanding the human mind then, right? Well, materialists have tended to think that computers and computer science is a particularly good way to understand the human mind, right? Computers are ultimately material things. They're just machines. The parts and how they work are tiny and lots of things are going on. But ultimately, you can understand everything about a computer by understanding the physical parts and how they work together. And the computational or functional theory of mind, you'll sometimes hear it called the computational theory, but more often the functional theory, is a kind of materialism. And it says, well, look, the model for understanding the human mind, it's like a computer. It's a very complicated sort of machine whose parts work together in a certain way, maybe more complicated than, current computers. but we can explain it in the same way. So, idea is, how do you explain the human mind and thinking? Well, how do you explain what a computer does, right? If I want to understand what my computer here does and how it does it, well, how do I understand that? How do we know what's going on? Well, the idea is program plus hardware, right? Computers run certain programs, but there's certain hardware that runs those programs, right? And so what functionalists will say is that human thinking and the human mind is really also just program and hardware, right? There's a certain program, our personalities, our thinking, our memories, and all that, and it runs on a certain kind of hardware, our brain. All you need to do to understand, the human mind is understand the program and the hardware, right? Program, you could break down to a certain kind of code. Hardware, you look and see what it materially does, right? But one thing to keep in mind is that in a very real sense, in one sense, the program is independent of the hardware. You can run the same program on a lot of different computers. But in another, thinking about the hardware is more primary or more important, right? Everything that happens on your computer when it runs any program can ultimately be explained in terms of what happens on the circuit boards, the chips, all those things that make it up, right? Look, nobody would actually do this because it would be so boring and so long. But theoretically, at least, everything that goes on can be understood by what happens in these chips, in this hardware, charges, ones, zeros. That explains everything that goes on, everything your computer does. And in the same way, the functionalist will ultimately say everything that happens in the human mind, all thought, be it playing chess, be it writing a poem, be it tasting ice cream, whatever, can be explained completely and totally by stuff that happens in your brain. When you play a video game, when you record a lecture, when you type something, when you stream a video on your computer, all that can be completely and perfectly explained by what happens in the hardware. The materialist, functionalist, they'll say, well, the human mind is exactly the same way. Little more complicated, maybe, different kind of hardware in that it's, this gray matter and not silicon chips, but same model works the same. They're both just really complicated machines. You understand the mechanics, you understand both. That's the materialist approach. Understand the matter, you understand, the mind. And the functionalist materialist approach, well, it takes our understanding of a very specific kind of machine, computers, as the way we understand the human mind, right? Okay, so let me say, draw that to a close. We'll say a bit more about this approach in the next lecture.